Thanks again. We started off a great talk with Jonathan. We so appreciate his time, and we're looking forward to getting to the rest of our sessions. So again, my name is Tim Opstrup, and I'm part of the Office of Cooperative Research, part of the team that helped bring this summit here today. So it was with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Professor Lin and Peter Farina. Hyphen's here at Yale. He's the director of Yale Stem Cell Center. And Peter Farina is with Canaan Partners. And I got to stop here for a second. Last year after the summit, Hyphen joined me at lunch, and he said, "You know something? I have a great idea." I said, he said, "What if I have some of my friends from China come over? We can do a China panel next year." And that was the birth of what you're seeing in front of you. And I really, it's been a labor of love. We started in October, and here we are. So I'm very, very excited. And I want to specifically point out, Hyphen, and thank you so much for your help. You were a tremendous support to us, and I really appreciate your help during this time. So thank you for that. So what Hyphen was able to do was bring many Chinese investors and other business people to Yale this week, and then we pulled Peter Farina in the middle and came up with a panel that we'd like to present to you today. So with that, Peter.
Thanks, Tim. So this is the Biotech session, and the title of this is China and Asia, Future Opportunities for Advancing Biotech. And it's a pleasure to be invited by Hyphen, Tim, OCR to moderate this panel. We have excellent panelists. Very diverse backgrounds. There are some common features, though. The majority are scientists, and we have one strong business person. So what I'd like to do today is go through some just very brief introductions of the panelists. Then we're going to ask them to go a little bit more in-depth into their background and also talk about their firms, the investment thesis. We're going to talk about some questions, and I think we talked yesterday with Jeff. The questions are to elicit thoughts. It has to be a formal question and answer, but basically to stimulate. And Hyphen is also, although I'm the moderator, he's the co-moderator, and he's going to be a panelist, so he's wearing two hats. So we're going to hopefully liven it up by having a discourse among the panelists, and then we'd like to have audience participation. I don't know how we're going to do that. Do we have mics? We do have mics. So we'll occasionally look up, and if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll try to get a microphone to you. So let me start by giving high-level introductions. I have right next to me Professor Lin, and as Tim said, he's the director of Yale Stem Cell Center, but he's also Eugene Higgins Professor of Cell Biology. And the last time I talked to Hyphen, I think he was honored on that day, where he's now been elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So I'd like to congratulate him. Next along here is Mr. Jeff Chen, who is a Yale School of Management graduate, so he's back in home territory. And Jeff is at Ascendant Capital, and he's a partner there. And Ascendant is a little different. They're basically a private equity firm, and I've asked Jeff later on to distinguish between private equity and venture. Many of you may know that, but some may not. Then going down the list, we have Dr. Yibin Wu, who's joint head portfolio management at Temasek. Yibin has a PhD in biochemistry, and he's going to be our keynote speaker this afternoon, so he'll have a lot more to say. Next is Dr. Wei Zhao, who's a vice president at Six Dimensions Capital, and he has a PhD in neuroscience. And then Dr. Stella Xu, who's a managing director of Quant Capital, and she has a PhD in immunology. Stella also worked for many years at Roche, both in the US and in China. We had some interesting discussions of people we know on both sides of the ocean yesterday. And actually, I was reflecting when I see, I also have a PhD in organic chemistry, So we have everything, all the different disciplines represented, plus a Yale graduate in business. And I thought we would start a biotech company after this session. So why don't we go down the line here and get a little bit more commentary from each of our panelists, background, firm, and I know Professor Lin wants to make some opening comments as well. So I'll start with you, Professor.
Sure, great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll be brief. Welcome to the Yale Innovation Summit. As you all know, Yale Innovation Summit really has been an exciting platform to showcase your researchers' innovation and creativity to the world. And in the previous years, the world has been focused on the Western world. So this year we decided to add a good dose of Asian element. And so therefore, here's this panel. We really hope that this session will provide us a great opportunity for us to learn about the tremendous economic development in Asia. And we are extremely fortunate to have invited 5 experts on economic development and on high-tech investment to this panel. As the only non-expert and the only Yale person on the panel, I'd like to extend a personal welcome to all of you to Yale, all the panelists, and also the audience for those who are not from Yale. I also like to express my personal gratitude to all of you for traveling a long distance to bring your expertise to Yale. So this discussion, I feel like it's extremely timely, especially given the current uncertain climate between the US-China trade and the overall relationship. And I think as I'm looking into this audience, we have a very sophisticated and engaging audience. And with this expert panel and the engaging audience, I truly look forward to an enlightening discussion. As for me, I'm the token academician here on the stage. So I see myself as a facilitator. I hope to facilitate for those of you who are in the audience who are from the academic side and you want to ask or discuss questions that you always wanted to know but are afraid to ask. I'll be here to help. So with that, I'd like to pass to my panelists.
Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jeff.
Okay, let me introduce my firm and also myself briefly. Our fund is called Ascendant Capital Partners. Our headquarters is in Hong Kong, and it was started by a group of SOM alumni. I'm one of them. And we started about 7 years ago. We are a private equity fund, which means that the difference between private equity and a venture capital fund is that we are mostly invested with relatively late stage ventures. And then in our portfolio, we also invest with startups, but not to a very big proportion. And then our investment theme is to invest with companies not only in China but also in the US with a China angle. And that's a lot of details into that, but I will be brief. So that's our firm. And then myself, I came to the United States about 25 years ago, and then spent 20 years studying in US and working in US. About 6 years ago, I went back to Shanghai, which is my hometown, and started up the Shanghai office for Ascendant Capital. And that's about my firm and me.
Okay, thank you.
Next is Yibin.
Hi, my name is Yibin Wu. I'm from Temasek. Temasek is a Singapore-based investment company. We have about $200 billion. We invest from late stage as in public equity all the way to early stage as in venture. We're about 90% direct investment, 10% invest in funds. So a lot of private equity and venture capital firms also know us as their LP. Personally, because of my background in biochemistry, I always had affinity to life sciences, and it is a very a growing area for Temasek's investment globally. Our asset allocation is about 29% in Singapore, 25% in China, about 14% in US, and the rest in the rest of the world. We do see in terms of life sciences and many technology advancement, you really have a global market, and in particular two major markets in China and US, and increasingly lockstep in both scientific advance and the market. So that's going to be the theme I will speak more about this afternoon. So with that.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Wei Zhao from Six Dimensions Capital. Really honored to sit amongst the very accomplished speakers and excited to share some of our learnings over the years. I come from Six Dimensions, which started as the corporate venture arm of Biotech. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a CRO, contract research organization based out of China, but really a global company with a global footprint. Probably one of the biggest contract research organizations in the world today, and it just went IPO in mainland China a couple of days ago. So we're a healthcare-focused venture capital fund investing in both China and outside of China. By outside of China, primarily in the US. In the US, we do mainly therapeutics, about 80%, and the rest 20% goes to medtech. In China, it's a more balanced mix of therapeutics, device diagnostics, some healthcare services, and IT. We spun out of Biotech corporate venture arm in 2015. And then in 2017, we further merged with a China-based fund called Frontline BioVentures and became Six Dimensions. Now it's what are the Six Dimensions? I probably don't explain it very well if I explain it in physical terms, but the way it got started was there were 5 senior partners. They were thinking about names. And one thought we might want to start with A, we would always be on the very top, and then one said, could start with numbers, that would be really on the very top. So initially they started with 5 dimensions because there were 5 senior partners. And then the president of the fund, who's also the founder of Biotech, said, well, there's always a dimension of the unknown, so let's call it 6 dimensions. A little bit of personal background. I grew up in China, did college over there, and then went to Chicago for my PhD in neuroscience, followed by a postdoc in Boston at Mass Andier, and then did management consulting at LEK before joining Wuxi Ventures, now 6 Dimensions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stella Xu, and I'm a managing director for Chuan Capital. So Chuan Capital is a new life science-focused fund started last year by 3 industry veterans. And like many of my colleagues here, we focus on healthcare. For us, because all 3 of us came from a long history of the full value chain of drug development discovery. So we focus mostly on therapeutics development, but also includes enabling technologies and service such as also precision medicine, companion diagnostic, and supporting infrastructure work. And also, like my colleagues here, we actually invest in good opportunities both in China as well as globally, including US and Europe. And our investment stage also like to focus on both early stage incubation Series A as well as late stage with clinical development proof of concept product opportunities. And on the personal background side, as Peter mentioned, before the fund, I worked for a long time in Roche and across the business development, licensing, as well as R&D management. The other 2 partners also came from a deep history of company building and venture investing. Both of them came from co-founders for Zai Lab, which is one of the leading Chinese biotech, and they went to IPO last September. Was one of the most successful IPO last year. So very much looking forward to the discussions here.
Thanks, Stella. And maybe I'll give you a little bit more background on myself. And so I'm Peter Farina. I'm an executive in residence at Canaan Partners. Been with the firm for 10 years. Canaan is, I think, well known to people in Connecticut. We do investments. We're on our 11th fund. We do investments in healthcare and tech. I think one of my colleagues is on the tech side in the upstairs session. Before Canaan, I spent 28 years here in Connecticut in R&D leadership at Boehringer Ingelheim. I'm a research scientist. I was head of development. And my interest in China was inspired by my last years at BI. I had many very talented Chinese scientists reporting into me, and when I left BI, they suggested I would see China. And so 10 years ago, I took my first trip to China. I was fascinated by what I saw there, visited biotech companies, academic institutions. I started talking to venture folks, but it was very, say, primitive at that time. And I've tried to go back every 2 years. And what I've seen is remarkable changes in China. And I think that's paralleled by Canaan. Maybe 5 years ago, we did not co-invest with Chinese investors. And now it's fairly routine. So there's been a sea change in how we see China, how we see the US. And I think the other impact is that there are a lot of returnees. There are many returnees from BI who have gone back to China, who have joined pharma companies, venture firms, startups, and so the dynamics have changed tremendously. And that has inspired me to participate in this panel. So let's start. I've been fascinated with trying to harvest the best from the West and the East. And there are so many different merits for the two different parts of our societies. And you can see that in business, you can see it in science, technology. But to my investor colleagues, how do you see, as an investor, the duality of the best of the East and the best of the West? How do you see that? Maybe Jeff to start with.
Well, it's an interesting question because Peter gave me the question before, so I thought about it. And
I'll say that.
yeah.
Spontaneous.
The interesting thing about it is as an investor, we always try to put together a framework so that we can think analytically, more logically. So the short answer to this question is I think between U.S., what's best in U.S. and what's best in China is that we have a vertical division of labor, basically. So a lot of the interesting ideas, basic science research, and the first batch of technology innovation are happening in the United States. And in the past 30 years, China has, interestingly, the development in China is basically you can see two stages. Well, the first stage is a lot of manufacturing business or industry migrate from everywhere in the world to China. And then if you think about the value chain, we talk about some of the along the value chain there is different links. The first link is where you have ideas, you have innovations, you have development of technology. In the middle, you need to have the manufacturing. You need to have someone actually make a product or actually form a service business. And then even downstream, that you need to have market. And in China, so what I see in the past 30 years is that we have developed a very robust manufacturing industry. And then also in the past 10 years, the Chinese economy is transforming itself from merely export-driven to a much larger consuming market. And then we believe we think it's going to be bigger than United States within 10 years. So to answer that question, how do you combine the best of the East with the West? We think that if we can somehow find interesting opportunities, make it a product in China and sell in China or sell to the rest of the world, it's the one form of combining the best of East and then the best of West.
Thanks, Jeff. Do you have any comments? You do strategic portfolio planning. How does that relate to your job? And
No, my day job is investing in China, so $50 billion investment. Really, what we see, the change in terms of both business world and scientific world in China, I would say within the last 10 years is a generational change or mind-boggling. I graduated in 1996 at my PhD in biochemistry. I did genetic switch. I did very basic stuff, like do mini preps and sequencing and all the stuff. Today is machine can do it, but back in 1996, the experiments cannot be repeated in China. This is one of the reasons that I had to join McKinsey, because there's no way I can, if I want to go back to China to do science research, it just doesn't happen. I mean, you have to do some rudimentary stuff. And today, I would say the labs, in China, Haifan will be many of them, will be equally equipped. Every scientific experiment that can be done here can be done in there. The difference major is you don't have great institutions like Yale, academic freedom, great ideas and all of that. But however, I think the world is changing. We all know the markets are global. If you're a company, if you just focus in the US and not focus in China or the rest of the world, you'll be limited. And capital is global. In China, in addition to a labor source, now it's become a major capital source. And now, finally, I would make the point, people always said labor are local. And I would say today, labor can even become global. And the reason is you have great companies like great CROs like WuXi Pharmatech. Essentially, what it does is arbitrage the labor, the high-end labor costs, right? So instead of doing it, in here, you can do it in China for the same standard, and they do it in the last year. 54 of the new molecules, like there are 40 some which went through them, right? So that's a way. So the globalization trend today is here, right? So one of the major theses I'll talk about this afternoon is not only in biotech investment and biotech in entrepreneurship, you have to be born day one to be global, to be competitive. I would say one of the theses, even in academic research, we should think about how you leverage the global trend, global resources to bear to advance more effectively and more efficiently.
Maybe I can say a few words. We're probably relatively familiar with what's best in the US. So what's the best about China? To start with, it's for many Western companies, especially small companies, it's an untapped market, and it's a huge and fastly growing market. And secondly, it is in fast transition. The development speed of China, we've all witnessed. It's impressive, to say the very least, as compared to the developed world. So with that comes a lot of opportunities, and sometimes disruptive opportunities. The healthcare system in China is heavily driven by policy changes, and we've seen many positive changes in the recent past. And another thing is valuation. It's a sheer supply and demand game. China is fastly growing, promising, and good companies are popping out. But there is also a huge demand for such companies and a lot of capital chasing them, to the extent that they couldn't find enough good companies domestically, and they have to come to JP Morgan every year in search of partnering opportunities or acquisition opportunities. So if we can find values in the US and plug it back into what's good about China, then we can collectively create value.
Stella?
So that's the point of being the last one speaking. Is I think that my colleagues here covered most of the key points. Clearly, from a technology development and from market development perspective, U.S. is here, regulatory system and all that. China is here, but catching up very quickly. So with this rapid growth, and therefore that means opportunities. And I think in addition to the market potential that Wei talked about, I think also with healthcare, it's I think a few different characteristics compared to our tech colleagues upstairs. You think about how this is really one industry, nobody can do it alone. Between a phenomenal discovery in a biology lab in Yale and other universities, there's such a long distance to go from target validation, therapeutic discovery, development, heavily regulated, manufactured, and then so I think in addition to think about how the discoveries from the U.S. labs or academia like here can be the market potential can be captured in big market like China, I think it's also important to think about how actually we can join our capabilities and resources together to understand better the biology, to de-risk the new therapies or new technologies, and to together reduce the risks and accelerate the life cycle. And I think that's the future collaboration with the capital, with capabilities like WuXi can offer for outsourcing, and think about how can we jointly do drug discovery and development more efficiently, meanwhile trying to also address our medical needs, not only in the developed market like US, but in the rapidly growing markets in emerging countries like China.
Stella, I mean, I'd like to comment in terms of my trips to China, what I've seen. Certainly in the U.S., we've seen a downsizing of pharma, particularly on discovery levels. Then the venture community is the engine that has brought biotech up. So there's a balance. A lot of discovery work is now done here in the States by biotech companies. On the China side, what I've seen is CROs grow. And my first trip to China, I went to WuXi, which was massive in 2008. But in each trip, it gets larger and larger, and the excellence continues to go up and up. And so there is a buffer now where you bring together the best of the East, which is doing phenomenal CRO work, with the biotech community here and the integration back into pharma. So I think that's been a remarkable change. The other part is capital available. We thought of it always as U.S. capital. Now there's China capital coming in to stimulate our biotech industry. But Hyphen, how do you see it as an academic? Yeah.
Oh, I think all the panelists really had articulated the trend really well. I see from an academic perspective, even basic research in China now has increased tremendously. And that kind of increase actually is without the awareness of my colleagues here, for example, at Yale. So I'll give you some statistics. For example, about 20 years ago, if any Chinese lab were to publish an international level paper, for those who are familiar with journals called the Journal of Biological Chemistry, he or she will be elected to the National Academy. Just need a few of those. 10 years ago, that became the bottom line standard for top Chinese institutions like Chinese Academy of Science and Sciences. And 5 years ago, that became not a good standard. Today, actually, China's total number of publication is second in the world. The high impact publication, the number of the papers, is the sum of UK and Germany, which are the two big science powers in Europe together, is about 50% US. When I showed this data, which is independent studies done by prestigious journals like Nature, my colleagues at Yale, they are all shocked. And now if you look into the trend, Europe, the research productivity is flat. Japan actually is going down. US, luckily, I feel very happy, is still going up with a slow slope. But China is going up like that. If you linearly project in another 5 or 6 years, even for basic research, China will be just as big a powerhouse as US. So that's something we need to start to recognize. And Jeff is completely right. So far, the most upstream intellectual creativity is mostly from US. But as an academician, I'm keenly aware of that we have to work harder. Otherwise, this situation will change too.
Is there any questions for the audience? Over there? Yes.
I'm Jimbo Lee.
Jimbo, hi.
Peter actually was my mentor at Boehringer Ingelheim. So I have a question for the panel of VC here. There's a lot of funding. I just came back from a conference in China, and they're saying that there are 30,000 VC firms in China. And so in terms of investment, we talk about late stage program and early stage program. For Biotech fund, which is I'm kind of familiar a little bit from the Harvard side, typically an early stage program. So what's your thought of investing in those programs?
Jump in.
Venture guys.
Oh, maybe I can get started. So I think from Trend's perspective, we're actually interested in both early and late. And I think end of the day, that what for our funds, because we all come from very heavy industry background. So early stage innovation, it's all about differentiation, right? What can you do actually that the current technology cannot deliver? What problems can you address more efficiently or more effectively that the current solutions don't work? So I think with that, then you carefully think about how much proof of concept you have versus how far you have to go. So I think it's the typical questions that the US VC think about. For us, we think about in China as well. And the last question we ask is how can the resources available in China or outside of China, whether it's in the US or Europe, can help you to de-risk those opportunities. And I think with different investors, different companies or firms would have different risk return calculation, different risk tolerance level. But for us, we like truly differentiated breakthrough early stage technologies.
Like Stella mentioned, that investing is all about one, risk management, two, play your value adding to the fullest to create value. So in terms of early stage, I'll break it down to investing in US versus investing in China. Investing in US, we do, so about half of our portfolio companies are in the US, mainly in therapeutics. And the way we evaluate US early stage companies is no different from what a typical US firm would evaluate that. And when we make investments in the US, we invest for the US market first and foremost. And the potential China partnership or a joint venture down the road, it's the upside. And that's not going to be a main driver of an investment. When we're looking at investing into a company for the China market, however, the definition of early stage might be a little different. In the US, you might, in order to compete in this, I call it advanced market or relatively developed market, you need to compete on high science. But however, in China, it's a different set of unmet needs. For example, a lot of the drugs approved by the FDA or DMA are not available in China. And therefore, just by offering a similar drug in China would create value and opportunities for companies. In the past, the regulatory pathway has been not as effective, but there's a lot of recent policy changes to facilitate that, to facilitate and accelerate the drug approvals. So in China, you don't really have to always go after the novelist targets. It's more about, let's say, if you invest in a domestic company, you're not even competing with a foreign company for the same target, same mechanism. The reimbursement system will treat domestic companies and international companies, or we'd like to call them multinationals, in parallel. Sometimes we even welcome the first approval of a drug from the multinational, or they'd like to call it MNC, because they would educate the market and educate the physicians. And then domestic companies come up with a similar drug and they would get reimbursed as long as it's good quality and it hits the market first among all the domestic companies. So those are some of the considerations. So in China, at least in the past, it's people play less on the biology risk and more on the execution. And
Let me follow up with some thought. We're sitting on the campus of one of the greatest academic institutions in the world. Professors here do a lot of basic science. Many of them, probably in this audience, are entrepreneurial as well. Venture folks like to interact with academics. So what are your expectations from a professor, and what are your expectations from the university to take their ideas and move forward, say, to company formation? How do you see that? Or do you do it?
so
If you can start.
I have a whole talk in the afternoon about that. Maybe I can just skip that. Let me come back to the China and Asia angle on that issue. I made 4 or 5 trips to Yale last year, and then visiting a lot of our portfolio companies in the U.S. The impression I've got is astonishing. It's almost like if you're in the U.S., you ignore the parallel universe that is happening on the other side of the world. Many of that, this is probably most exemplified by our dear president, is you see the world is very old lens, right? So the popular perception is still, it's a major manufacturing house, and probably you still think about the CRO and all of that. And I think the simple idea I want to plant in the audience heads is it's a parallel universe. It's a complete vertical system that has everything that US has. But, some of the value chain components are younger, so they're catching up later, right? So manufacturing, I think probably it's equal with the U.S. Contract research, probably now it's equal in the U.S. Original research, as Haifan said, is catching up very quickly. And even in the early stage, as you say, the early stage companies, talk about Chinese innovation in terms of biotech companies. We've seen really over the last 20 years, I worked with Legend in the early 90s, and late 90s and early 2000. I give them a very distinct advice. Do not invest in innovative biotech in China. Invest in generics. That's 2000. And people made a lot of money investing in generics. Those are 15 years ago, right? So if you think about probably 5-10 years ago, most people are doing Me Too drugs. Those are where the China say, you've got the same drug, let's just do some with a little bit of modification. The last 3, 4, 5 years, I would say, they are identifying novel molecules on the same target. China has probably 30 PD-1 in the pipeline, being under the Chinese CFDA pipeline, and probably with only 4 or 5 will get it approved. So now a lot of company has recognized even on the same target novel molecule will not get you there. And a lot of the early biotech companies we will see, they would have 2 or 3 molecules that's on the same target, and then now they are onto novel target. In terms of the capital available, not only you have a slush of capital from venture, but even the corporates. China, all that generation of the large generic pharmaceutical companies, some of them has transformed themselves into new companies. They invest in early molecule too. So I would say for university and for early, venture, for early entrepreneur, you really should think about how I plug into that universe in every component of the value chain, right? Not just at the very, very late stage. It's a huge market. That'll be way too late. The earlier you cut in that universe, the better off, because I deeply believe science and innovation fundamentally are global, right? So, because your not only market are global, your capital is global, labor is global, so science and innovation has to be global.
Yeah, and was there a question? Please.
Yeah, my name is Peter Young from Younger Partners, Life Science and Chemicals Investment Banking. I have a question, two questions that are heavily related. If you look at the history of biotech, successful biotech innovation and new companies, you'll find that there has to be an ecosystem, and if one part is missing, it doesn't work. So if you look around the world, that's why even why there's a concentration of successful biotech companies and so forth, heavily in the US in certain places and more difficult in Europe. So the first question is, in China, what parts of that ecosystem, whether it's funding, R&D, approval, et cetera, are working, and what parts still need some work in terms of having an ecosystem that allows these biotech companies to be successful? And related to that, as probably everyone here knows, this last week, the Hong Kong exchange passed some rules that finally allowed biotech companies to actually do IPOs only on the Hong Kong exchange, because until now, if you didn't have revenues, you couldn't do an IPO, which of course eliminated all biotech companies, right? So what effect do you think that will have, again, on the China biotech ecosystem?
Colleagues?
So maybe I can talk about it because I have spent the last 10 years in China actually covering different sectors of the ecosystem. So I think, like my colleagues here mentioned before, the difference is phenomenal. So 10 years ago, when I went back to China to managing the business development licensing work for APAC for Roche, it's actually, you can see that all this development, what just talked about, from generics to Me Too's, then now to actually hopefully best in class, now to actually me first in class. So that's clearly increasing. And another significant improvement is the regulatory policy. 5 years ago, when I was started to manage Roche's R&D center in China, we actually have to come up with all kinds of reasons to say, how can I actually keep up pace with the projects discovered in our Shanghai lab, but development pathway in China versus for the rest of the world is just going to be so delayed. But I think we just have to give credits to the Chinese government for the CFDA-related reforms that's happening in the last couple of years. It went quicker and went further than most of people, even industry people, expected or imagined. And so today, now you can actually start early development in China without the needs to do manufacturing in China. You can actually do multi-center global trials. You can also do independent Chinese trials. So that big bottleneck in clinical development and review process are being removed. Now, there are still hurdles and barriers. For example, FDA has thousands of reviewers, highly qualified with in-depth experience and expertise, as well as industry background to review the first-in-class mechanism of actions and drugs. While in China, the CFDA, probably the number of reviewers are orders of magnitudes smaller, and the people are less experienced. But at least China joined ICH, being harmonized with the review policies, and is growing towards that direction. And I think that's another reason why these two countries should collaborate with each other, because if you think about it, with the regulatory expertise here in the US, the system that FDA has set up for first-in-class drugs reviews, while you're combining that with the big patient population available, naive treatment patients that urgently needs new therapies, I think there's a lot of synergies to be captured, not only in the early stage discovery set, in the clinical development field, but also, of course, in manufacturing as well. So therefore, if you consider the ecosystem, what do you need? You need money, capital, clearly, Chinese money is there. You need people, talents, all the returnees, especially really, really top quality returnees. Professor Lin is spending also time and efforts in China as well. From academia to industry are going back. And then projects both discovered in China, as well as technology transferred from US or Europe are going back. And the regulatory system. So I think all these factors are catching up, and it's pretty robust and healthy and continue to grow very rapidly. Now, is it as perfect as in Boston, as in Connecticut, as in Bay Area and San Diego? Probably not up there in all corners, but that actually for VCs like us, that's opportunities. So if you think about, in addition to invest in classic first-in-class innovation in the US, another investment opportunities for VCs like us is to think about how can I help China to grow their infrastructure, to grow their ecosystem. So that's one. And secondly, very quickly, I think the Hong Kong Exchange, the new effort is very exciting to all the players throughout the ecosystem in China right now, because finally there is a local potential access that's available. Suddenly came out this year that nobody had thought about would be possible 3 years ago. Again, that's a good example of the changes that's happening very quickly. And I'll leave my other colleagues to comment on the Hong Kong.
No, I just want to comment. I absolutely agree with that. I think the biggest change is on the CFDA side. If you say before, what was the most major difference is the regulatory system. It's so arcane. Some simple thing, HBV vaccine. China is lagging 9 years in China. So that created essentially a revolution, in the industry. People saying this is just ridiculous. It's a basic health, and all women at young age should get. And why should we be 9 years before? And then that is one of the factors, together with the new CFDA head, made that change. That made all the things that Stella said that's possible, and that would fundamentally change, as I said, the value chain, accelerate the entire the value chain, the system, and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. We are on the advisory board of the Chinese, the CSRC is called. It's basically security regulator. I see how much hunger they have in terms of learning all of this, right? They leverage the international advisory board, and then they say, how do we make our, sort of the Asia exchanges more competitive? And before, as you say, Chinese A-share stock exchange is one of the most arcane, system. No one wants to go list there. Part of the reason is it has very strict requirement for you need to be a number of years to be profitable, right? To be listed in A-share, and that actually infected in Hong Kong. That's why all the innovative companies in China has listed in the U.S. It's Alibaba is in the U.S. and a lot of the biotech companies in the U.S. Now Hong Kong Stock Exchange says, no, I want some of that. So that's the change of that. That changed the entire, of course, the Asian regulators, Asian investors would understand Asian companies better. So what we see is a lot of companies, both in China and in the U.S., are flocking to Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
So can I just build on that? I'm looking out at the audience, and a number of U.S.-based VCs, and traditionally, U.S. VCs have been very reluctant to invest in China-based companies for a variety of reasons: time, distance, culture, and then I think most importantly, repatriation of money back into the U.S. Has that changed? Certainly China money is coming into the U.S. What do you tell the folks out in the audience who are venture capitalists?
That I have.
Is this a good time, or is it wait and see?
Oh, that time has changed. So we, as I said, we have about $5 billion as LP money in Chinese. And then DPA, this is for VCs that we understand, essentially it's the cash distribution at the age. And then all the Chinese funds now are first quartile now. The top quartile Chinese funds is very, very comparable to the US first quartile. Just specifically 2010, 2011, 2012 vintage DPA, the DPI is more than 100%. So essentially, if you you committed in the first fund in 2011, now you would get your entire capital back. And because the change is because all the China has much more robust M&A market now. A lot of listed companies, generic pharmaceutical companies buying biotech companies. That's a major trend last year. And IPOs are much more open, and then all the regulatory system change. It's not a problem.
So jump in.
I would say it's already too late. Maybe. By the way, not all U.S. companies are not doing, Sequoia, for example, right? I think this, like doing business anywhere, for a Chinese company to be successful in the U.S., you need a local presence. Like multinationals found out, J&J, Roche, to do better in China, you need a better, China company. Right, so Sequoia, because of Neo Shen, which is a distinguished alumni from Yale, and he run a great franchise. And Sequoia China asset under management is more than Sequoia US. You probably don't know that.
Yep. Please.
I have one question for investors. IP versus capital. how do you evaluate the intellectual properties in paper, inventions, patents in your investment? Is there any rules or just negotiating case by case? And it seems to me that IP are valued much more higher in US company than in Chinese company. Is that true? Thank you.
Well, I guess in 10, 20 years ago, that would be a concern, but nowadays it's much less of a concern for us. I guess even to my surprise that China is implementing the international standards pretty well.
Let's go to another question.
Yes, hi. Brian Harvey from Thetis Pharmaceuticals just down the road in Brantford. Just to build upon what you were saying about the improvements and the optimism with the work at the Chinese FDA, one of the things that I've been aware of is that I was at the US FDA 15 years ago, and as GI division director, I had a medical team leader, Rui He, who's now at the Chinese FDA. So he's bringing many of the best practices and policies and procedures and transparency to the process. So there's a lot of optimism in the regulatory space. And so my question to you is, if someone is developing a product, are we now at the point where the opening IND for a drug or an IDE for a medical device, is that something now that can be done? So China first for clinical development, are we there? And if not, how quickly do you think that next step will be?
So I think before 3 years ago, there's a big requirement for local manufacturing. So unless your API or your drug substance are manufactured in China, you cannot start early stage trials in China. I think now that has been removed. And therefore, and I think depending on your question, we're asking of a product candidate from the Chinese company or from overseas company. So obviously for Chinese company, this has never been a barrier, right? You discover in China, you manufactured it. And I think companies may pick different countries or different regions to do their R&D depending on the speed of execution and the future market they're targeting for. Now, for US companies or entrepreneurs, I think it is possible now to do early stage trial in China. Now, I think as an investor, I would still advise you to say, if you compare the speed and patient resources, if you start from healthy volunteer versus you started immediately from patients in certain indications, that may direct more where you want to start your clinical trial versus. I think the regulatory environment is much more friendly now. But of course, if you go to the approval level, I think if you come in a little bit late to the Chinese market, you probably still have to do trials to prove the ethnic difference is not there and the PK and so on and so forth would still be equivalent. So I think there's still some additional work to do if US companies with clinical stage projects going to China a little bit later. But if you started early, as the panelists mentioned here, if you started to plan your global development plan early, and I think that's much more efficient now than before. And I think then your global development plan, where China, how important China is, and how proactively, how early you start that plan for China, depending on indication, right? If the vast majority of your patients is over there, then you think differently versus you have a major market here.
Yeah, so just add, I think very simply, if you look at very big picture, 5 years ago, you have to do US first, then China. So today, with the regulatory change, you can really do simultaneous, parallel, which many of the multinationals are doing. Today, theoretically, you can do China first, but CFDA does just deep down doesn't want to take that risk to really have the first in global, right? Because they want to see FDA, they have a little bit of the risk averseness. But if you take the trajectory, and certainly their intention is they want to do first, global first.
Hyphen, thoughts, questions from your side about investing from the university perspective?
I actually like to invite the audience from the academic side to ask some questions. Could you raise hand if you're an academician, namely you're working at university? Yeah, a small number, I'm surprised. Okay, so do you have any questions? For example, yes, please.
motivation for Chinese investment company invest technology in the United States? I was thinking maybe for the consideration of diversity of investment portfolio, that's legitimate. Even the geopolitical consideration. So what is the real motivation for Chinese money invested in this country? Another fault is Americans seems not ready to receive Chinese money, especially consider the environment today. I had a few cases, all right? I represented a Chinese company to invest in this country. At least 3 teams withdraw from the investment. And they told me, first, if there's American money, they do take American money. So Chinese money as if they don't have the funds from America. Now some say even they don't have the funds from American, they probably won't take. At least have to think very carefully about the funds from China. So that's quite challenging.
I think it's probably too simplistic of a way to make this dichotomy of China money versus U.S. money. Even in the U.S., there are money I wouldn't want to take, right? Just there are high-quality U.S. investors and there are low-quality U.S. investors, and same thing with China. There are plenty of high-quality Chinese investors that can be value-adding. I guess in terms of value-adding, if it's a promising company, if the company has no issue getting money, then the capital everybody has, and it's about the value adding. So it's all about what you can bring to the table.
It's very interesting. I like to address that question. First of all, Temasek is a Singapore company, so it's a Singapore money. And then you look at the people on this table. I was born in China. I'm a U.S. citizen. I work for a Singapore company. I manage investment in China, and I manage global asset allocation, and then we're looking after our life sciences money. So for us to invest in U.S. or invest in China, for us, it's pure. It's 100% Singapore money. However, let's speak for our colleagues here. Many of them, I think, you see a continuous spectrum. Maybe you, Haifan, Haifan has the same background as me. We graduated about the same time. It's happened to be he worked in Yale. I work in the Singapore company, right? Now if Haifan managed money, is his money more U.S. than my money? Right? So it's a very interesting question. So a lot of the funds, they would raise, the GP is somebody with the Asian base, and then you say, oh, okay, then it's Chinese money, and then maybe most of it's LP. The LP world is global. We, as I said, we're $5 billion invest in Chinese GPs. Why do we invest in Chinese GPs? Because they are the best to make money in China. Right? That's the only reason. And then you ask a question, which is great. What's the motivation of many of the Chinese money? When you ask the motivation of money, the answer is only one. The motivation of money is money. It's just that simple.
Yeah, I would say, to answer your question, it's interesting time for me to do a little bit of commercial for our fund. Is that 60% of our investor, which means LP, limited partners give us money, are actually U.S. money. They're the pension fund, they're the endowment fund, and also we have a variety of government fund, which does not include a Chinese government. It's a Singapore government, Hong Kong government, Australia, Finland government. So it's a very global investor base. So you would safely assume this is very much on the investment side. It's a very much globalization already. And so for us, if we want to work with a U.S. company, usually there are two things. Right? One is if we want to put money with a company, it is together we can grow the pie bigger. To help the company to penetrate Chinese market. And so to make the pie bigger, and then also the second thing that we tend to do, to put it simply, is try to make the distribution of the bigger pie more fair, right? So that's another important thing. You know, people talk about IP protection. It is a very, very big theme for life science investment, right? So for us, if we work with a company in the United States, we do tons of research about IP enforcement issues in both in US and in China. So that's the benefit to work with a very globalized fund like us. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
And Jeff, I think that was well said, and I think that also means we have one more? Okay, I'm told we can do one more question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm an academic here. I'm looking to start a new company. Very excited by the prospect of working with Chinese venture groups, not just Chinese CRO, but Chinese pharma, and have had a number of discussions with them. I've been extraordinarily impressed. So thinking about what you guys have said about China not just being, wanting Me Too drugs, not just wanting to do CRO development work, but wanting to innovate. If you're a new company here in the United States with a novel asset, first in class, something that's exciting here, what thoughts did you have about how to, in a capitally efficient manner, access the China market at an early time point? And what's the best way to do that, or what are your thoughts generally around that? Start a new company, get started in China quickly after you have clinical data in the U.S. Any thoughts?
So one thing that we do is not only do we invest in the U.S. company directly, but we also partner with them in China in the form of a JV or a NewCo. In the case of NewCo, you can inject new capital and new equity ownership into that company. You can develop the drug, the asset in China. You can tap into local capital, not only equity capital, but also non-dilutive funding, local talents, and access to patients. And in some cases, you have quicker access to patients in an investigator-initiated trial that will guide your U.S. development. In other cases, if you partner with the right CRO, clinical research organization, to the extent that you have good data, you can even leverage that data for your U.S. filing.
Yeah, I would say probably 4 steps. Step number 1, I used to do technology licensing for Harvard. Definitely tick the box for China. Don't ignore that box, right? Huge money. So that's step number 1. Then second is when you raise capital, probably at least have some representation who is, I would say, well plugged into that ecosystem, so that you have, smart money advise you how to attack that market. And third, to the extent if you got into development stage or clinical trial, try to leverage whatever CROs or clinical CROs, so that you are run today, per the prior discussion, in parallel in China. And fourth and most difficult would be, as early as you can, think about build presence in there. But that's always challenge, right? When you build a company, it's hard enough to start in one location, you want to start in 2, and then you really have to assess your risk and return in there. But I would say you want a higher payoff, and that would be the higher investment I would definitely advise you to do.
Thank you. I'm getting the signal this is a wrap. First, Professor Lin, thank you for inspiring this session. Thanks, OCR, for putting it together. Panelists, you did a wonderful job. I hope you demystified China investments for the audience. Thank you all.
Well, thank you. Great job.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Haifan and Peter. Thank you, everybody. We will look forward to more discussion with Yibing Wu's keynote address at 3 p.m., where we'll hear some more. Thank you. That was